He was a futurist from New Jersey who turned out to be a Renaissance man, and whose discussion of breast enlargement with an actress led to the development of radio-controlled torpedoes and eventually Bluetooth. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about George Antheil. Antheil was born in 1900 in Trenton, New Jersey, to a family of German immigrants. As a youngster, Antheil was precocious, and he dabbled in almost every creative medium, but he was especially drawn to music. At the age of 6, he started studies on the violin and the piano, although he never had much formal schooling, and he never graduated from college or even high school. Very few details about his early life are certain due to the often exaggerated nature of his autobiography, The Bad Boy of Music. He studied the piano starting at the age of 16 under a pupil of Franz Liszt, a fellow named Konstantin von Sternberg, and these lessons eventually turned into composition lessons as well. When Antheil was 19, he began studying privately with the composer Ernst Bloch in New York, who was slow to warm up to Antheil's style because Antheil was using the piano as a purely percussive instrument, much like Edgard Varèse or Bela Bartok was, and he was fascinated by machinery and in imitating machinery. Because his lessons took him to the major metropolitan areas of both Philadelphia and New York City, he became intimately familiar with the growing scene of Dada, and he met many influential figures of modernism, including the pianist and composer Leo Ornstein. Despite studying composition elsewhere, Antheil remained on friendly enough terms with his old teacher von Sternberg, to the point that von Sternberg introduced the young Antheil to Mary Louise Curtis Bach, who would go on to found the Curtis Institute of Music. She ended up supporting Antheil monetarily for a long time to come, which freed Antheil to pursue his own compositional goals. By the age of 21, he was writing some of his most savage and vicious works for solo piano, including 3 piano sonatas and player piano pieces, all imitating cold, hard machinery and savage steel. He also continued work on a symphony, which he'd been trying to write since he began studying with Ernst Bloch in New York, and even managed to lure Leopold Stokowski into premiering it. But he felt like in some way America had nothing to offer him, and he hired Leo Ornstein's manager and went on to try to become the Leo Ornstein of Europe. Even though Ornstein was originally from Russia, he focused his compositional and pianistic career in the United States post-World War I. And while he achieved a degree of fame, which we shall see, it was in many ways a Pyrrhic victory because his stipend from Miss Bach had been significantly slashed. Nevertheless, he did still receive over $40,000 from Miss Bach throughout his career, although he would end up referring to it as a hindrance as much as a boon. After a year in Europe, Antheil met Igor Stravinsky, who told him that Paris was the cultural capital of Europe and thus the place for any budding young artist like him to be. Stravinsky helped to arrange a concert to establish Antheil's name in the city, but Antheil didn't show up. He preferred to tour Poland with his girlfriend. The next year they were back in Paris, but Stravinsky had turned on Antheil. Not only had Antheil skipped his own concert, which Stravinsky had worked to promote, but Antheil was using Stravinsky's name to basically promote himself. Despite all of this nonsense, he ended up finding himself in Paris, where he fell in with many of the best thinkers and artists of the time. This included Ezra Pound, who took a real liking to Antheil's music. He'd seemingly found his people. His Parisian debut, about which more later, actually caused a riot, not unlike the famous riot at the premiere of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, but unlike Stravinsky, Antheil basked in the fact that there was a riot. To him, the only press was good press, and so he really relished the fact that he was in the news. As it turned out, the riot may have been engineered for a film, but this didn't deter Antheil at all. The premiere of his solo player piano piece Mechanisms saw Eric Satie himself cry out from the audience, "What precision!" In French, of course. Ezra Pound, who admired Antheil's music to the point that he wanted to write an opera with him, published a book called Antheil and the Treatise on Harmony, which contains many of Antheil's views on the subject. Antheil saw time as an important but often overlooked concept when studying harmony, and he felt like the study of common practice harmony was simply the study of what chords could follow each other in quick succession, but that any chord could follow any other chord in any piece, in any context, so long as there was a given time interval between the two. To that end, he seemed to dislike academicism in the study of music theory. But more about the piece that caused the riot. It was after he established himself as a futurist that he allowed himself to go completely all out in this one particular aesthetic direction. This found a home in a piece called Ballet Mécanique, which was originally intended to be a score accompanying a silent film of the same name. But during his collaboration with the filmmakers, they decided to go their separate ways, and indeed Antheil's score lasts about twice as long as the film. Antheil wanted violence and efficiency, with mechanical player pianos and unusual percussion instruments arranged on stage like an army. He called it the first piece of music that has been composed out of and for machines on Earth. Large fans to imitate the sounds of airplane propellers were wheeled on stage, and 16 player pianos were to be called for, until he realized that in the year 1925 there was absolutely no way that you could synchronize that many player pianos. He would rewrite the piece periodically to include different instrumentation and always more human performers. In fact, it wasn't until the turn of the 21st century that the technology exists to allow Ballet Mécanique to be heard in its original scoring. As a publicity stunt, he arranged for a fake news story saying that he had been eaten by lions on an African journey. The riotous premiere pitted those who were sympathetic to futurism against those who thought it was simply sheer cacophony. Antheil, for his part, wrote that he would be the new darling of Paris. Paris loves you for giving it a good fight. He seems to have an inflated view of himself, especially towards the press, writing, "My Ballet Mécanique is the first piece of music that has found the best forms and materials lying inert in a medium that, as a medium, is mathematically certain of becoming the greatest moving factor of the music of future generations." He was soon to see the ballet as something of his equivalent of Rachmaninoff's C-sharp minor prelude, something that brought him fame, but something he came to despise simply because it was the only thing people knew about him. He would claim that 1925 saw the end of his imitation of machinery in music, but analysts would tend to disagree with him. But Antheil felt like his career was incomplete unless he had achieved the same fame in his homeland as he had had in Paris. And so in 1927 he set off for New York, fully intending to take Carnegie Hall by storm. As it turned out, taking the audience by storm was all too literal. The fans, instead of being pointed at the ceiling as they were at the Paris premiere, were pointed towards the audience, blowing their hats and programs off. One guy even attached a handkerchief to the end of his umbrella and started waving it around like a white flag. The audience wasn't just baffled, they were battered, and to add insult to injury, the piece was completely fraught with technical difficulties, including instruments that just simply refused to play. In one instance, the air raid siren wasn't warmed up, and so instead of it occurring at the climax of the piece, it sounded after the piece had ended and people were filing out of the hall. The critics just lambasted the piece, and Antheil, who kinda sorta wanted a riot, never got one. His audience just saw it as a pathetic display, too much to really bother. The fiasco was so total that his reputation was ruined in large swaths of the musical world, and he moved thereafter to Germany, because in Paris, around the same time, his piano concerto was being premiered, and the modernists there turned his back on him because the piano concerto was too tonal, much like what happened to Leo Ornstein. His first opera was well received, but when the Nazis came to power, he was forced out, and he moved back to the United States where he met Aaron Copland, who was bound and determined to be the driving force keeping American composers together through the tough economic times of the Great Depression. But Antheil still could not achieve any success in the Big Apple. His work, now tinged with more traditional tonal aspects, led him in the late 1930s to Los Angeles, where he became a film composer. He didn't like the line of work he found himself in, because he thought the directors were too hostile to any sort of modern music. He didn't really feel like a composer as much as just someone who was working on the film. Nevertheless, he still thought there was a lot of worth in his music, and he was of the opinion that his music, and his music alone, was the one factor keeping certain movies from being complete box office flops. But unlike some film composers, he didn't let film work completely take over his career. He wrote symphonies and music for ballets as well. His first-hand experience with Nazism led him to become a part of the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. And in fact, his predictions on World War II, which were published in a book, were scarily accurate. He predicted that Poland would be invaded by Germany, which would start the war, and then eventually the US would get involved. Antheil, quite bizarrely, wrote a nationally syndicated love advice column where he detailed how to pick up women based on how their glands were affecting their appearance. He called it glandular criminology and published books with titles such as The Gland Book for the Questing Male. This is exactly as bizarre, nonsensical, pseudoscientific, and misogynistic as it sounds, but it led to an important development, because in 1941 he met the actress Hedy Lamarr, who had apparently read his works and thought that he was the right man to give her a breast enlargement. Their conversation turned to torpedoes, as all good conversations should, and it led to their co-invention of a system where radio-guided torpedoes couldn't be jammed by enemy ships. They did this by modifying one of Antheil's player piano scores to randomly send a signal on one of 88 different frequencies. However, for some reason, the United States Navy was not a fan of this development. Antheil, for his part, believed that the system could be shrunken down to the size of a pocket watch. But he said that the brass-headed gentleman in Washington who examined our invention read no further than the words player piano. My God, I can hear them saying, we shall put a player piano in a torpedo. They didn't implement it until the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was kept classified until 1985. The technique was later modified into something called spread spectrum, without which we wouldn't have much of modern telecommunications, including Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. This latent rediscovery of their invention led the unusual duo of composer and actress into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. So yeah, Bluetooth wouldn't have existed if Antheil didn't believe what he did about female glands, which goes again to prove that the truth is stranger than fiction. Antheil knew the power of stage presence. He would come on stage with a revolver and put it down the piano, supposedly to give him a sense of peace of mind during inevitable riots. Also, his treatment of the piano as a purely percussive instrument led him to injure himself on a semi-regular basis. He would spread rumors that he was part of a mafia family just to drum up attention for his concerts. He never was able to achieve truly lasting fame, but he was well regarded by all the artists who knew him. And while Futurism may not have lasted, he was an important figure in its development. Writing, "We shall see orchestral machines with 1,000 new sounds, with thousands of new euphonies, as opposed to the present day's simple sounds of strings, brass, and woodwinds. Of course, we will find sentimental people who will object that there will then be no more of these wonderful imprecisions in performance. But, dear friends, these can be added. Do not object. You can have what you want, but let us go on."